Today's video is sponsored by Incogni. More on them in a bit. At the risk of being predictable, we need to talk about lines. No, not those kinds of lines. These kinds of lines. The front lines of the war in Ukraine. Specifically what is happening, or not happening, with entrenchments in the east. They have low-key been the driving force of the war's pace for more than 2 years now. However, where they are starting to get attention today is through talks of a US-imposed/influenced ceasefire. Basically, a ceasefire line will come down from the heavens. Then, Ukraine, perhaps with international partners, will entrench the entirety of the line to ensure that Russia cannot easily try to restart the war later on. Think of it as a replication of the Korean demilitarized zone, except on the European continent, and 70 years younger. One slight problem. This historical analogy completely misconstrues the order of operations, and it fails to grasp the basic logic of coercive bargaining. Thus, today we shall pair the lines with the lines. We will begin by taking a time machine back to November 2022, the moment when defensive entrenchments took over the war. Then we will fast forward to the spring of 2023, and how one particular line both stopped Ukraine and tricked Kyiv into not developing its own line. Afterward, we will discuss the current predicament that Ukraine finds itself in, along with the Russian perspective on a ceasefire line. And finally, we will conclude with how Ukraine can fix the problem and put itself in a better coercive bargaining position. Now, to be clear, simply turning the tide in a war is no easy feat. Sure enough, here the solutions will be both time-consuming and expensive. Never mind literally earth-moving. It is easy to think to yourself, well, a trench is nothing more than a long hole in the ground. How hard could it be? It turns out it can be very hard, especially when another army is doing everything that it can to further make your life difficult. But success in this regard may be the difference between state survival and a fate that Kyiv would prefer to not even think about. But first, today's video is about where to draw the line when it comes to security. However, your personal security matters too. That is why it is only fitting that the sponsor of today's video is Incogni. Did you know that some of your personal data may just be sitting there on the internet, which could help cybercriminals take out loans under your name, give health insurance companies the knowledge to raise your rates, or allow bulk data brokers to add your name to lists of vulnerable targets, never mind all the other risks that you just saw on your screen? Well, fortunately, that is where Incogni comes in. You create an account, and then they do the dirty work to help remove your personal information. They will even handle any objections that data brokers make along the way. So take back your personal data with Incogni. Use code WilliamSpaniel, all one word, at the link below, and get 60% off Incogni's annual plan. That's right, a quick visit to incogni.com/WilliamSpaniel will have you all taken care of. For the beginning of our defensive line story, we travel back to November 2022, and the Russian retreat from Kherson. Up until that point, maneuver warfare had been the order of the day. Fast-moving strikes, and only brief periods of face-offs in the trenches. In brief, following Russia's initial declaration of the invasion, and then Ukraine's series of offensives, there were 3 main thrusts. First, the expulsion of Russia from Kyiv, then the strikes in Kharkiv, and finally the liberation of Kherson. At the time, the Battle of Kherson was heralded as a major milestone of the war. It was the largest city that Russia had occupied, that Ukraine subsequently expelled the invading troops from. You get the sense of the magnitude of the event by the celebrations that took place in the city afterward, including a visit by the president. And indeed, by comparison to current events, it is night and day. We often look at these Russian gains from the past 7 months as being concerning for Ukraine. However, Ukraine retook about 4,500 square kilometers in November 2022 alone. That is roughly 7 times as much as Russia's best month as of late, hence all of those celebrations that popped up in the aftermath. Nonetheless, a key decision point for Kyiv would shape the next two phases of the war. There was a single bridge that spanned the Dnipro River out of Kherson. Russia used that bridge for its withdrawal, and then detonated a span of it to prevent Ukraine from pursuing. Now, Kyiv could have selected a very different strategy. Rather than let Russia simply leave the city, Ukraine could have spared no missile and made the bridge impassable as it began closing in. Without support and replenishment, whatever Russian soldiers that could not find a boat to cross the river would have been easy pickings. Instead, Kyiv let them go, worried that the victory would come at the cost of the destruction of Kherson. The decision indeed saved the city, but it also altered the course of the war. The next phase of the narrative moves to Ukraine's failed 2023 offensive and the defensive line that stopped the blue and yellow soldiers. As the rain came in to turn all roads and battlefields nearby to mud, and then temperatures plunged heading into December 2022, it was clear that Ukraine would have to pause its offensive operations until the weather cleared. Actually, a decision had to be made about pursuing a follow-up offensive at all. Armies only have so many soldiers, and military planners have to decide how much labor to put into offensive operations and how much labor to put into defensive preparations. The dilemma is that offensive operations are more likely to succeed the more effort is put in that direction. And when it comes to reuniting your country, it is a tempting option. However, overcommitting to the offensive, and subsequently failing, means that the opponent will have a much easier time taking more territory the next time that it goes on the attack. For Kyiv, the decision was to lean heavily into the offensive. It was a reasonable choice at the time. After Ukraine pushed Russia out of the Kharkiv Oblast, the Kremlin went into panic mode and mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers on September 21st, 2022. The Russian troops were not in a particularly good position to fight, though, and would need time to train into something formidable. Thus, Kyiv had a simple plan. First, cut Russia off along the land bridge to Crimea. Second, pursue Russia south along the wedge between the Dnipro River and the Sea of Azov. And third, turn back to the more heavily fortified Donbass area later. However, Step 1 barely got off the ground. You see, the Russian troops that survived the Kherson offensive had gone to work fortifying the line of control north of the Dnipro River's natural barrier. Known as the Surovikin Line, it was the brainchild of the not-so-coincidentally named General Sergei Surovikin, who had pled with the Kremlin to withdraw from Kherson and focus on building entrenchments along Russia's remaining holdings. Well, it worked, and though Ukraine's decision to keep up the offensive seemed reasonable given the information that it had at the time, in retrospect, it was a mistake. The short-changed offensive allocations meant that Ukraine lacked an equivalent of a Surovikin line on its side, and thus Russia has made steady gains in the time since, first working through the few fortifications that Ukraine had laid down, before picking up the pace as Ukraine started backpedaling. It is not the only reason that Ukraine is losing ground, of course, and I covered 9 other key issues in a companion video over on the Lines on Maps Extra channel. But it is a big one. And that takes us to the bargaining problem that Ukraine now faces, as Trump and Putin appear set to discuss the topic. Indeed, Kyiv envisions a fortified front line as a key part of any ceasefire plan. Both Ukraine and Europe do not want to be in a position where, a year or two later, Russia decides to restart the war and see how much more that it can take. Thus, as commonly discussed, the solution is Step 1, draw a new de facto border, Step 2, fortify the heck out of it, and Step 3, hold it for however many years or decades it takes. Basically, we are looking at a 21st century Korean demilitarized zone, except the DMZ is 250 kilometers long. Ah, the joy of living on a peninsula. In contrast, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a whole different beast. the current front line runs about 600 kilometers. The upshot there is that about 280 of those have a natural boundary in the form of the Dnipro River. The downside is that there are another 770 kilometers of border between the two, and there is yet another 770 kilometers of border between Belarus and Ukraine. And you probably want to cover that too, given that Russia attacked Kyiv through there. In total, that gives us more than 2,000 kilometers to fully defend, plus a bit more with the river. But it is not just the greater distance that is the problem here. In fact, the bigger problem with using the Korean War as a model for today's situation is that it completely flips the ordering of what happened 70-something years ago, and runs against the basic logic of the feasibility of peaceful settlements. Let's start with the latter part. Ending a war requires relative consensus on what the expected outcome of the conflict would be, should it be fought to a military conclusion. Going to the bitter end results in all sorts of costs, both human and financial. Certainly the Kremlin is aware of this, given how bloody the ongoing offensive has been. Let the white line represent a hypothetical expected outcome of the war, and represent those costs in terms of the square kilometers between the white line and each country's respective colored line. Thus, we are left with a range of settlements mutually preferable to war. If only it were that simple. One layer of complication here is that the expected outcome of the war fought to a complete conclusion, absent a ceasefire, must be roughly equivalent to the expected outcome of a war fought to a complete military conclusion if restarted after a ceasefire is implemented. Put simply, the military outcome now needs to be similar to the outcome of the hypothetical second Russia-Ukraine war. For example, suppose that Russia anticipates that continuing the war would produce an outcome that looks like this. Then the minimum ceasefire line acceptable to the Kremlin is this literal red line. But you can imagine what would happen if Ukraine suddenly forked over that much territory. The line on the other side is still not set up, and Russia has not been drained of any of its men or materiel in the process. Put differently, Russia would still be ready to keep on fighting. And now that it already took control of territory out to here, its expected outcome if it restarts things has instantly shifted out to there. No way that the Kremlin would follow the ceasefire line as structured at that point. And as much as I hate to draw on World War II analogies, this was the central problem with the Munich Agreement. It handed over the best fortified positions of Czechoslovakia. What a shock it must have been to discover that Nazi Germany, now in a better position militarily than it was previously, started demanding more land. So much for peace for our time. The alternative is to build a line closer to where the front is currently. But that just falls flat on its face if it is worse than what Russia expects from continued war, precisely because it fortifies the area in a manner favorable to Ukraine. And indeed, this is a problem that the Kremlin raises whenever discussions of a settlement arise, seen here from Putin's end of 2024 press conference and call-in show. This is where the comparison to the end of the Korean War falls apart. The ceasefire worked there because the sides had been fighting to a stalemate over the same strip of territory for an extended period of time by that point. Consequently, fortifying what would become the demilitarized zone roughly matched what the war expectations were. And, equally important, neither side was gaining a military advantage by scaling up their fortifications in the area. One side's gain simply offset its opponent's gain. In other words, the current discourse on frontline fortifications flips the ordering. It is not Step 1 ceasefire, Step 2 fortifications. It is Step 1 fortifications, Step 2 ceasefire. Now, we have discussed before the logic of the conditional armament peace plan coming from the United States, where aid gets cut to Ukraine if Ukraine refuses, and gets ramped up if Russia refuses. It is fully possible for such a proposal to overcome the bargaining problem described here. However, it is reaching a peace the hard way, and not where Ukraine has good bargaining leverage. time to conclude with some brief thoughts about how Ukraine could solve the problem, or at least maybe mitigate it. Well, building a solid front line is the answer, though obviously that is easier said than done. It is a bit surprising that Ukraine has not been able to sort out the problem more than a year into Russia's offensive. It is especially surprising given that Ukraine has not suffered the same problem north of Kharkiv. This bump in territorial exchange from May 2024 occurred because Ukraine had left open a small window for Russia to take, should Moscow decide that it was worth the redeployment. However, unlike the Eastern Front, this did not cause a spillover problem. Russian gains plummeted the following month, and only went up afterward due to losses in the east. One issue is that choosing a location for a front line comes with its own trade-off. The closer to the current line of control, the more that you ultimately keep. However, you have less time to construct it, and if it gets run over, then you are back to square one. It seems hard to believe that Ukraine would keep getting this problem wrong for more than a year. Heck, a conspiracy theorist might suggest that Ukraine is doing this as a political strategy to maximize Russian casualties, baiting the Kremlin into trading land in hopes that the deaths cause political turnover in Moscow. Alternatively, maybe Ukraine just cannot stop Russia right now, in which case there will not be a deal with Russia anytime soon, US intervention or not. Regardless, Ukraine really needs to just pick some place, fortify the heck out of it, and hold steady from there. That would perhaps require more manpower and materiel. Where the manpower will come from? Good luck. Ukraine has an untapped cohort that Kyiv has not wanted to mobilize, because the government would really prefer that they make babies instead. Hooray, demographic legacies of the Soviet Union. At least putting them in such a role is away from the current line of control, so they would be at a lower risk of casualties. On the western side of things, ramping up equipment to build fortifications would be a start. Remember, this is something that gives Ukraine better bargaining leverage in ceasefire negotiations. And if those negotiations fail, it still benefits Ukraine militarily on the battlefield. That, of course, is just one part of solving Ukraine's problems on the Eastern Front. You can learn more about the other issues by watching today's companion video over on Lines on Maps Extra. Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring today's video, and you can learn more generally about the war by reading one of these two excellent books on the subject. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.